Bedtime Reading. Sons and Lovers. Chapter 1. The Early Married Life of the Morels. Mrs. Morel had been married for 8 years when she and her family moved to the mining town of Bestwood. They had only been in their new home 3 weeks when the town fair began. Morel, her husband, had left early in the morning. William, a 7-year-old boy, left after breakfast. Annie, who was only 5, cried to her mother that she wanted to go to the fair. But Mrs. Morel did not know any of her neighbors well enough to trust them with taking her little girl to the fair, so she promised to take her after lunch. William returned for lunch at 12:30. He was a very active boy with blonde hair.
"Can I have my lunch now, Mother?"
he asked. "You can have your lunch as soon as it's ready," said the mother.
"Is it ready yet? I'm going to be late,"
he said, while his blue eyes stared at her. "No, you won't," she said. When lunch was ready, William ate it very quickly. As soon as he had finished, he ran for the door and left without saying a word. Annie started crying that she wanted to go to the fair too. You shall, said Mrs. Morel. So, later in the afternoon, she and her daughter climbed the hill leading to the fair. Mrs. Morel did not like fairs. She went to get Annie some sweets. When she returned, William ran up to her with 2 cups he had won.
"I won these in the game where you have to throw the balls into the holes,"
he said, very excited. She knew that he had won them for her. "They are very pretty," she said. He was full of excitement now that his mother had come. He thought that she was the most beautiful woman at the fair. The small boy took great pride in his mother. So he was very sad when she told him that it was time she and Annie went home. He stood watching them walk down the hill, but soon the excitement of the fair took hold of him again. William returned home at 6:30. He asked if his father had returned yet. "No, he will be drinking with his friends, is my guess," said Mrs. Morel. When her children went to sleep, Mrs. Morel was left alone. She thought about her life and how nothing in it would change until the children grew up. She thought about the child that was growing inside her, and how, at the bottom of her heart, she knew that she didn't want it. She hated the child's father, drinking himself stupid at the fair. She told herself that she would leave if it wasn't for William and Annie. At 11:30, her husband came home. His face was very red above his black beard. She knew that he was drunk. He talked on in a drunken way about what had happened that day. Mrs. Morel, who was tired and sick of his talk, went to bed as soon as possible. Mrs. Morel had come from a proud old family. Her father, George Coppard, was an engineer. He was tall and handsome, with blue eyes. Gertrude looked more like her mother, small with brown hair. But her personality was like her father's, strong and proud. George Coppard, whose father had lost all his money when the cloth business became bad, George hated his own poverty. He was a bitter man. Gertrude hated how he treated her gentle and kind mother. When she was 23, she met the 27-year-old Walter Morel at a party. He was tall, with black hair and a big black beard. He was very different from the men she had met before. He laughed loud and often, and he seemed full of life. She was the opposite. She was usually quiet and thoughtful. Nothing excited her more than an argument with an educated man. At heart, she was a very serious woman. Walter Morel thought she was amazing. To the miner, she represented all that was outside of his world. She spoke very well and in an educated way. This thrilled him. She watched him dance. He danced very well, as if it was natural for him to dance. His grandfather had come from France and married an English girl. Gertrude watched him dance and laugh and thought that he was wonderful. Her father never danced or laughed. He was far too serious. And even though she was very much like her father, there was something about this young miner that captured her imagination. He seemed so full of happiness and life. He came and stood in front of her. She felt warm inside, as if she had been drinking wine.
"Will you come and dance with me?"
he asked. She told him that she couldn't dance. She looked at him and smiled. Her smile was very beautiful. It made him forget everything else. He sat down beside her.
"I don't think I'll dance either,"
he said. "Are you a miner?" she asked.
"Yes. I started when I was just 10 years old,"
he replied. She looked at him in amazement. A new type of life opened up before her eyes. She thought about the hundreds of miners working below the earth. He seemed very brave to her. He risked his life every day and did it happily. Her heart went out to him. A year later, they were married. He had promised not to drink. For 3 months, she was perfectly happy. For 3 months more, she was very happy. They lived in a house he said he owned, which had new furniture. It was small, but she did not care, so long as her husband was with her. Sometimes she tried to talk to him about serious things. He would listen, but she could tell that he did not understand. He seemed most happy when there was a job to do around the house. He was very good at making or fixing things. They had been married 7 months when Mrs. Morel found out that the house he said he owned was in fact owned by his mother, and that there was still a large amount of money owed for the furniture. His lie destroyed her trust in him. Morel was good to her when William was born, but she felt lonely now when she was with him. William was a beautiful child with golden hair and bright blue eyes. She cared greatly for the child, and the father was jealous. Morel's temper had become so bad that when the child cried, he would hit it. Mrs. Morel would scream at him, and he would leave to get drunk. She knew now that he had never stopped drinking. William was 1 year old with long golden hair, when one Sunday morning he was downstairs playing with his father. His mother could hear them from her bed. Then she fell asleep. When she woke up and went downstairs, she found William sitting on the ground, surrounded by his long golden hair. Morel had cut all the child's hair off.
"What do you think of him?"
he asked. "I could kill you!" she screamed.
"You don't want him looking like a girl, do you?"
he said. She started to cry. Morel sat with his head in his hands. When she stopped crying, she said that she had been silly. But his act had put further distance between them. As time went on, he began to drink more and more. He also made less and less money. He would give his wife money each week to keep the house, but the amount would depend on how much he had made, for he always kept enough money to buy his beer. Mrs. Morel did not know if she preferred the weeks when he made a little or a lot. When there was little, she had a hard time buying all she needed, but when there was a lot, Morel would come home drunk every night and cause trouble. At the time of the town fair, Morel was making little money. Mrs. Morel was trying to save for the new baby, so it made her very angry to see her husband wasting money on getting drunk. The day after the fair was a holiday. At 9:30, Morel's best friend, Jerry Purdy, came to the door. The men were planning to walk to the large town of Nottingham. They set off across the fields, stopping to drink at every place they passed. They had lunch in Nottingham. All afternoon, they drank and played games. At 7:30, they caught the train home. When they reached Bestwood, they stopped for a final drink. The next day was a work day, and the thought of it started to make the men feel bad. So most of them began to go toward their homes. Morel had felt good drinking with his friends, and the thought of going home made him angry. When he reached the front gate, he could not open it, so he kicked it and broke it. He surprised his wife when he came rushing through the door. "My God," she said, "coming home drunk again."
"I'm not drunk, woman,"
he yelled. He sat down at the table, rested his 2 arms on it, and thrust his face towards his wife.
"I'm not drunk,"
he said.
"Nobody but a mean little dog like you would say such a thing."
"You go and spend our money on drink, like there is nothing else to spend it on," she returned.
"I haven't spent anything today,"
he said. "So, you get this drunk without money, do you?" she asked.
"Get out,"
he screamed. "No," she screamed back. He got up and moved towards her. She backed away, but he took hold of her and pushed her out the door and locked it. She found herself out in the cold night. The shock of what had just happened and the anger she felt filled her. It was some minutes before she began knocking at the door. When there was no answer, she went to the window. Through it, she saw Morel asleep, with his head on the table. It was a long time before her knocking woke him. When it did, he came to the door. "Open the door, Walter," she said coldly. He did, but by the time Mrs. Morel had entered and locked the door again, he was halfway up the stairs to bed. Drunk and too ashamed to face her, he was already asleep when she came to bed. Chapter 2. The Birth of Paul. After a bad argument such as the last, Morel would be quiet for some time. He saw now how difficult it had become for his wife to do her work. She was very close to having her baby. He now came home straight after work and stayed at home. He only went out on Friday nights, but would still come home before 10 o'clock and still quite sober. He would make his own breakfast, since he was a man who always awoke early. He would get out of bed at 5 and go downstairs. This was the only time Mrs. Morel ever got any real rest. She needed him to be out of the house before she could relax. When the time for the arrival of the new baby came close, he would sometimes help with the housework, cleaning the fireplace and sweeping the house before he left for work. When Mrs. Morel would come downstairs, she would find the house tidy but dirty. She could not rest until it was clean. One morning, Mrs. Morel called to her neighbor, Mrs. Kirk. Mrs. Kirk climbed over her fence and ran into the Morels' house. "How are you feeling, dear?" she asked. "I think the baby is on its way," she said. "I'll call for the nurse." replied Mrs. Kirk. The nurse came and Mrs. Morel went to bed. Mrs. Kirk gave William and Annie lunch when they came home from school. Morel was working in the mine. He was usually one of the last of the miners to finish work for the day. But today, by 2 o'clock, he was sick of work. He was digging at a piece of rock that was in the way of the next day's work. He was working very hard.
"Are you ready to finish?"
asked Barker, one of the other miners.
"Not while the world stands,"
growled the tired Morel.
"It's a heartbreaking job,"
said Barker. Morel was too tired and angry to answer. He kept hitting at the rock with all his strength. Barker left to journey to the mine's entrance. Still, Morel kept working. At last he stopped. He was very tired, and still the rock had not been removed. On his way to the entrance, another miner told him that it was raining outside. The walk home was wet and miserable. Many of the miners stopped to have a drink, but Morel felt too tired, so he continued home. Mrs. Morel was in bed. She had given birth to a boy. It made her happy to think that she would be the mother of men. The child had blonde hair and blue eyes. Love swelled inside her. Morel was thinking about nothing as he came home. As soon as he entered the house, the nurse was standing in front of him. "Well," she said, "she's about as sick as it is possible to be. It's a boy." The miner said nothing, walked to his chair and sat down. The nurse went upstairs to Mrs. Morel. "Was that my husband?" asked Mrs. Morel. "Yes," replied the nurse. The fact that his wife was sick and that he had another boy was nothing to Morel at the moment. He was too tired. He wanted his dinner. He hated the fact that the nurse was about the house and the fire was too small for his liking. After 20 minutes he went upstairs. It was difficult to face his wife. His face was black and covered with sweat. His clothes had dried, soaking the dirt in. He stood at the foot of the bed.
"How are you?"
he asked. "I'll be okay," she answered. He did not know what to say next. He was tired, and all this trouble was too much for him.
"A boy, she says,"
he said. She removed the sheet and showed him the child.
"Bless him,"
he said. "Go now," she commanded. He wanted to kiss her, but he felt she did not want to be kissed. She half wanted him to kiss her, but could not bring herself to give any sign of it. She only breathed freely when he was out of the room, leaving behind him a faint smell of the mine. Mrs. Morel had visits from the town priest, Mr. Heaton, every day. He was young, very poor, and well-educated. Mrs. Morel liked him very much. They talked for hours. Sometimes he stayed for lunch with her. Then she would get her best cups and plates out. At these times she would always hope that Morel would stop for a drink, so he would not come home while Mr. Heaton was there. On this day they were halfway through their first cup of tea when Morel came through the door. The priest looked scared. He was feeling angry. He said hello to the priest.
"Are you tired?"
asked Mr. Heaton.
"You don't know what it is to be tired,"
answered Morel.
"No, I guess I don't really,"
said the priest. Morel poured out a cup of tea and drank it whole. Then he poured out another, leaned over to the priest, his mouth very red in his black face, and said,
"When a man comes home from working in the mine all day, he deserves some peace and quiet, doesn't he?"
The priest said nothing. One evening, soon after Mr. Heaton's visit, feeling unable to deal with her husband, Mrs. Morel took Annie and the baby for a walk. she sat down in the field and watched the sunset. Looking at her baby, she seemed to sense sadness in him. The boy looked as if he understood the pain of the world. She started to cry. At that moment, she felt that she and her husband were guilty in some way. She no longer loved her husband. She had not wanted this child, but there it was in her arms. "I will call him Paul," she said, not knowing why. She went home. The house was empty, as she expected, but Morel was home by 10 o'clock, and that day at least ended peacefully. Morel at this time was always tired and angry. He did not speak to any of his family, except to yell at them. One Friday night he was not home by 11 o'clock. Mrs. Morel wished he would come home so she could go to bed. She sat with the baby in her arms. "I'll say nothing when he comes," she told herself. "I'll say nothing even though I know my blood will be boiling." She heard him coming through the gate. He was drunk. She sat as before, holding the child.
"Is there anything to eat in the house?"
he asked. "You know what there is to eat," she responded. He walked angrily into the kitchen. There he tried to open one of the drawers for a knife. It would not open, so he pulled at it with all his strength. Suddenly, the drawer and all the knives and forks in it flew into the air. Hearing the noise, the baby started to cry.
"You should be getting my food,"
he yelled. "Get your food. I would rather get a dog's." He threw the drawer at her. It hit her on the head and fell into the fireplace. She was bleeding and felt sick in the stomach. Looking down, she saw drops of her blood falling on the child. At least the baby was unhurt, she thought. Morel stood perfectly still. The reality of what had just happened was working its way through his drunkenness.
"Did it hit you?"
he asked in a gentle voice. "Go away," she said. She could smell the drink on him. Using all the strength she had remaining, she stood up and went into the kitchen. She washed the wound and cleaned the blood from the baby. Even this effort was too much for her. She returned to her chair, all the while keeping the baby very close to her. Morel, being very gentle now, asked,
"What has it done to you, my wife?"
"You can see very plainly what it has done," she answered. He stood above her, supporting himself on the back of her chair. She tried to look away, for the sight of him made her sick. As he looked at her, he could feel her hatred. All life and hope seemed to run out of him. He was about to turn away when he saw a fresh drop of her blood fall upon the child's golden hair. "What of this child?" was all she could say to him. He sunk forward. She could sense the fear and pain in him. "Go and get me a bandage from the drawer," she said, feeling sorry for him. He did what he was told, like a little boy who will do anything to regain the favor of an angry parent.
"Let me tie it for you,"
he said in a voice that expressed all his fear. "I can do it myself," was all she could reply. In the morning, she told the children that she had hit her head on a door the night before when her candle had blown out. Morel stayed in bed for most of the day. He tried to tell himself that it was her own fault, and that if she treated him in the way that he should be treated, nothing like this would ever have happened. But his own mind kept troubling him. He knew that the only cure for it would be to start drinking again. Only then would he be able to escape himself. He got out of bed at lunchtime. All through the meal he was silent, and all the family could feel his anger. After lunch, he left the house, slamming the door as he left. As he left, Mrs. Morel laughed to herself. "He is such a child," she thought. But the laugh was a bitter one, for she had once loved him. Chapter 3. The Casting Off of Morel, the Taking On of William. During the next week, Morel's temper was very bad. Like all miners, he was a great lover of herbal medicines. He would keep many bunches of herbs to make tea. Yet his tea was not enough to stop him from falling ill. He grew very weak from a swelling of the brain. Now Mrs. Morel had to nurse him, and he was a very difficult patient. Even with all the hate she had for him, she was scared that he might die. There was still a part of her that could not imagine life without him. The neighbors were very good to her. They would feed the children and sometimes look after the baby. But even with their help, she still had a lot of work to do. She was very tired at the end of each day, but she always did all she had to do. The weeks passed. Morel started to get better. He was still a strong man, so once he started to get better, he was soon well again. His wife had taken very good care of him, and he had enjoyed it a lot. Now, even though he was better, he wanted her to continue. She knew he was out of danger, so she would not listen to his childish cries. "You are a grown man," she would say. "Stop acting like a little boy." This hurt him, but he was forced to stop. There was peace in the house for some time. She was kinder to him, and he acted as if she were his mother. Up to this time, she still had looked upon him as her man. Yet now, she came to lose all desire for him. Her living still depended on him, but that was all he was to her now. Mrs. Morel moved away from her husband and towards her children. Like so many men in middle age, Morel was forced to accept that from now on he was no longer the center of his wife's life. He was pushed to the edge of the family. This change did not happen without both of them trying in some way to stop it. They would sit together at night while Mrs. Morel did her sewing. Morel, smoking his pipe, would not be able to sit still in his chair. He felt very alone, while her thoughts were always of her eldest son, William. His soul would reach out to her and find her gone. He soon could not stand this feeling, so, in his heart, he gave up the life he had known. She knew this and felt sad for it. But her life and thoughts now belonged to the children. Out of this final attempt at love did come something. There was a new child on the way. Mrs. Morel was sorry when she learned about the new baby. She worried that they would not have enough money to support the family. The baby was a boy. They called him Arthur. He was a good-looking child with blonde hair like the other boys. The baby loved his father from the start. Hearing the miner's footsteps on the road, the baby would put his arms in the air and smile. If Morel was in a good mood, he would call to the child.
"What is it, my beauty? I will come and see you in a minute."
Mrs. Morel was happy that this new child gave his love to the father. It made her heart feel less cold. William was growing bigger and stronger. Paul, however, was still small and quiet. He followed his mother around like her shadow. She was very proud of William. He went to the night school to learn bookkeeping and was the top of his class. Later, he became a teacher at the same school. He now had a bad temper, but his usual friendliness and his size protected him from any trouble. Mrs. Morel thought that William was a very fine young man. At the end of each week, he gave all the money he had earned to his mother. She would give some of it back so he could enjoy himself. He never drank, so the little money he had went a long way. He played sports with the other young men of the town and went to all the dances. William would always tell Paul about the beautiful girls he met at the dances. They were like cut flowers to William. They faded after only 2 weeks. Sometimes a girl would come to the door looking for him. "Is Mr. Morel in?" the young lady would ask. "My husband is at home," Mrs. Morel would answer. "I mean the young Mr. Morel," the girl would say very shyly. "Which one? There are several," would be the reply. "The Mr. Morel I met at the dance last week," the girl would say, now ready to hide in a hole. "I don't like girls he meets at dances, and no, he isn't home," Mrs. Morel would say, as she closed the door. William would come home angry with his mother for having turned the girl away. He was a careless yet lively young man, who walked with long steps. He sometimes looked sad, but usually he went about town with his hat pushed to the back of his head, looking like he didn't have a care in the world. Now he came into the house looking angry. He threw his hat onto a chair and stared down at his mother.
"Did a lady come to see me yesterday, Mother?"
he asked. "There was a girl."
"And why didn't you tell me?"
"Simply because I forgot," she said. He went away very angry with his mother. When he was 19, he found a new job in the city of Nottingham. His pay would be doubled. Both his mother and father were very proud of their son. Everyone thought William was going to move up in the world very quickly. Mrs. Morel now hoped that, with William's help, all the other children would become successful. Annie was now studying to be a teacher. Paul, who was also very smart, was having lessons in French and German. Arthur, a very good-looking young boy, was at school, and there was the chance that he could go to the high school in Nottingham. William remained a year at his new job in Nottingham. He was studying hard and becoming very serious. Something seemed to be worrying him. Still, he went to the parties and dances, though he never drank. All of the children were very much against drinking. He came home late at night and stayed up even later studying. His mother worried about his health and told him to choose one or the other. "Go out to parties and dance if that is what you want to do. But don't think that you can work during the day, go out at night, and then come home and study. You can't. The human body won't stand it. Either study or go out to parties. Don't try to do both," she told him. Then he was offered a job in London. His pay would be more than any of the family could imagine. It seemed so much. His mother did not know whether to be happy or sad.
"They want me in London next Monday,"
he told her. Mrs. Morel felt everything go silent inside her.
"I told you I could do it. Just think, me in London. And I can give you enough money each year so you will be rich,"
he said in a very excited voice. "Yes, my son," she answered sadly. He never thought that she might be more hurt by his going away than happy for his success. As the day of his leaving drew near, her heart began to close and grow black with sadness. She loved him so much. More than that, So many of her hopes lay with him. She almost lived through him. She liked to wash his shirts so he would look good. She was proud of his good looks. Now she would not be able to do that for him. Now he was going away. It felt to her that he was not only leaving the town, but also leaving her heart. He seemed to be taking all of himself away. A few days before he was to leave, he was only 20. He burned his love letters. They had sat in a pile on top of the kitchen cupboard. He had read parts of some of them to his mother. Some she had read herself. But most of them were very childish. Now he said,
"Come on, Paul. Let's go through my letters. You can have the pictures from the paper."
Mrs. Morel had done all of the day's work the day before, because she wanted to spend all of his last day free to enjoy his company. She was making him a rice cake, which he loved to take with him. He didn't even see that she was very sad at his leaving. He took the first letter from the pile. It was purple. He smelled the paper.
"A nice smell. Here, smell it,"
he said. He pushed the paper under Paul's nose.
"What do you call that smell, Mother?"
he asked. "I don't want to smell their foolishness," she said.
"This girl's father,"
said William,
"is as rich as can be. He owns land without end. She calls me Frenchy because I can speak French."
"Ha!" laughed his mother. "Isn't that a silly thing?" William felt uncomfortable, so he stopped reading this girl's letter, giving Paul the corner of the paper with the picture of a flower. He kept reading parts of his other letters, some of which made his mother laugh, some of which made her sad and worried for him. "Well, some of them seem smart," said Mrs. Morel. "They know all they have to do is say nice things about you, and you will follow them like a dog."
"I'll never be caught by one of them. I will keep jumping from one to another,"
he said, very proud of himself. "I only hope that is true, my son," she said. William threw the letters into the fire. Soon they were nothing more than a black heap of dead hopes. He turned his back on them all. He was off to London to begin a new life. Chapter 4. The Young Life of Paul. Paul was growing up to be like his mother, thin and small. His blonde hair had turned red and then dark brown. His eyes were gray. He was a quiet child with eyes that always seemed to look deep within the person he was watching. He seemed older than his age should be, and was always sensitive to what other people thought about him. As he grew older, he became stronger. William was too much older for him to be close, so Paul belonged to Annie. She loved her little brother very much. All the children were totally against their father, siding always with their mother. Morel continued to get drunk and angry. There were times, stretching for months, when he made the life of the family a misery. Paul never forgot coming home one night to find his mother with a black eye. His father was standing with his head bowed, and William looked at him with great anger. There was silence as he entered, but none of the elder family members looked at him or explained what happened. William's face was white. His fists were closed. He waited till the children were quiet. Then he said,
"You coward! You wouldn't do it if I was home."
Morel's blood was boiling. He turned round on his son. William was bigger, but Morel was as hard as stone from his work in the mine.
Wouldn't I? You be careful, young man, or I'll give you something to complain about,
Morel replied. They moved towards each other, ready to do battle. "Stop it, both of you!" cried Mrs. Morel. "In front of the children, no less. Look at them."
Look at the children, you say? You terrible little dog. What have I done to them?
He shouted. Everything was quiet for a while. Then Morel angrily went off to bed. It was the end of another day. Paul hated his father. He would pray at night.
Make him stop drinking. Lord, let my father die at the mine.
When Morel did not return for dinner, the whole family would start to worry. The thought of him sitting and getting drunk in his dirty clothes made Mrs. Morel feel sick. She knew that a man who did this would bring no good to himself or his family. He was shut out from all family business. No one told him anything. The children would always tell their mother about their days. They would leave nothing out. But as soon as their father came in, everything stopped. He was always aware of this sudden silence, but now it had been happening for too long to change. He would have loved the children to talk to him, but they could not. Sometimes Mrs. Morel would say, "You should tell your father," but they never did. The only time he entered the family life was when he had some work to do. If he was fixing boots or a pot, he would always ask the children for help. They enjoyed this, for when their father had a job to do with his hands, he was a different man. He was happy and would sing and tell them stories about life in the mine. The children were always very interested to hear his stories at times like these. But these times of gentle happiness could never make them forget the times of pain and anger. Paul was a boy who was often sick. The other children rarely were. One day he came home at lunchtime feeling very weak. "What's the matter with you?" his mother asked.
Nothing,
he replied. But he ate no lunch, so his mother made him lay down. He spent the afternoon half awake, listening to her do her work. He became so sick that he had to spend weeks in bed. He did not mind much. He thought that there was nothing he could do to change his situation, so it was no use worrying about it. At night he would lay in bed watching the fire's light, playing on the wall, imagining men and battles. His father was always gentle to anyone that was sick. Before going to bed, Morel would come into Paul's room to see how he was doing. But Paul only felt bad when his father was in the room. He wanted his mother. Paul loved to sleep with his mother. Sleep is most perfect when shared with someone you love. He lay against her and slept, and in the peace he found laying next to her, he got better. After William had left for Nottingham, it was Paul who became Mrs. Morel's closest friend. Paul had always been a little jealous of the attention his mother gave to William, so now he was perfectly happy. It was Paul's job to collect his father's money on Fridays. This meant that he had to go to the mine's office and wait in line with many others. A man behind a desk would call each of the miners' names, and he or one of his family would step forward to collect the money. Paul always felt nervous waiting for his father's name to be called in the crowded room. He was very shy. When Morel's name was called, Paul was behind a large group of men at the back of the room. He called out, but he was not heard. The man called Morel again. All the other people in the room began to look around and call out. Still, Paul could not be heard. Finally, he made his way to the front. Now all eyes were on him, and he felt very nervous. The time it took to collect the money seemed like forever to him. All he wanted was to be out of the room. When he got home, he told his mother that he would never again go to collect his father's pay. "Then you must tell your father that," she said. Paul continued to collect the money on Fridays. Friday nights were baking nights. Paul would stay home and watch that nothing burned. He would sit and draw, happy to be alone and happy to be doing what he loved. Mrs. Morel would be shopping at the markets. This was her weekly adventure. People came to the markets from all the surrounding towns. There was a sense of excitement in the air. Mrs. Morel loved to find a nice little dish or cup that she could buy cheaply. If she found such a treasure, she would always rush home looking like a schoolgirl who has just won a prize. She would always ask Paul, "Guess how much I spent on this?" When his answer was more than she had spent, which it always was, she would laugh with great pleasure. So each of the family had their little activities in life that gave them happiness. They were very poor that autumn. William had just gone away to London, and Mrs. Morel missed the money he used to give her. Now he sent money rarely. He wrote often to his mother, telling her about his life in the big city. She wrote back very quickly, long and loving letters. He was still in her thoughts most of the day. He was coming home at Christmas for 5 days. Mrs. Morel was busy getting everything ready. Paul and Arthur were sent to find all of William's favorite things. Annie was busy making the house look beautiful. The whole house was alive with excitement. William was coming on Christmas Eve. Mrs. Morel looked at all the food she had made. There were all the cakes and pies that William enjoyed. The house smelled like a bakery. The 3 children had gone to the train station to meet him. The wife and husband sat silently. The time of his arrival came and went, yet still there was no sign of him.
"What time did you say he was coming?"
asked Morel. "The train arrives at 6:30, she answered.
"He should be here by now, then."
"Don't be stupid. The train from London on Christmas Eve is always late," she said. Meanwhile, the 3 children were at the train station waiting. They waited an hour. A train came, but William did not get off it. It was very cold. Paul wanted to ask someone when the London train was due, but he was too afraid to do so. They kept waiting. They all grew silent. He wasn't coming, they thought. They looked in the direction of London. It seemed a whole world away. At last, after more than 2 hours, they saw the lights of a train coming around the corner. It stopped, the doors flew open, and out jumped William. They all ran to meet him. At home, the parents were now very worried. Mrs. Morel sat in her best dress, pretending to read. Then there was the sound of voices and footsteps. It was him. Mrs. Morel ran to the door to meet her son.
"Mother,"
he cried, "my boy, you are home at last." Morel and his son shook hands. He was a fine young man, dressed very well and looking very successful. He had brought them many different presents, things that they had never seen in their little town. Everyone was full of happiness. He told them endless stories about the wonders of London. The family was all at home, and they loved their home on this night, no matter what suffering there had been. Many people from the town came to see William. They all thought that he was a fine young man with a very bright future. When he went away again, the children were all very sad. Morel went to bed feeling miserable. Mrs. Morel felt as if she had died a little. All her senses stopped working. She loved him very much. William was working for a lawyer who was dealing with a large shipping company. They offered him a trip on one of their boats during his summer holiday. "You should go, William. You may never get the chance again," his mother told him. But William came home for his 2 weeks' holiday in the summer. Not even a free trip across the seas, which seemed a great adventure to the young man, could make him give up a chance to come home. At the bottom of her heart, this made Mrs. Morel very happy. She felt that she was still the most important thing in her son's life, and as he was the shining light of her life, nothing could have pleased her more. Chapter 5. Paul enters adult life. Morel was always a careless man. He was often hurt at the mine. About a year after William had left for London, Mrs. Morel heard a knock at the door. When she opened it, a young boy was standing there.
"Is this Walter Morel's house?"
he asked. "Yes," said Mrs. Morel. "What is it?"
"It's your husband. He's been hurt. They have taken him to the hospital."
Mrs. Morel came back inside. "It must be serious if they have taken him to the hospital," she said to Paul. She started to get ready to go to the hospital, packing a small bag with what her husband would need. In a few minutes she was out the door, headed for the train station. Paul watched her go along the road. His heart went out to her. It was more pain and trouble for her.
"Is it bad?"
he asked as soon as she returned. "It's bad enough," she replied. She sat down. Her face was white with worry. The 3 children knew that it was bad for their father. The house was silent. Annie started doing the housework, Arthur went outside to get some coal, and Paul returned to his painting. Morel survived his injuries, and so did the family. Mrs. Morel had to be very careful with money while he was off work, but in the end they made it through. In their hearts they wondered when all the troubles would end. They seemed to appear one after the other. Paul was 14 now. He was looking for work. Still, he suffered very much from dealing with new people or places. He was a good painter for a boy his age, and he knew French and German quite well. Yet none of these skills were very useful in finding a job. He didn't really want to get a job. He thought it would make a prisoner out of him. But his mother wanted it, so he looked hard and wrote many letters. At this time, William's letters told of all the fun he was having in London. He also told of a girl he was seeing. Mrs. Morel warned him to be careful, as it is easy for a young man to lose himself in a pretty face. One of Paul's work letters was answered. It was from a company in Nottingham that made hospital supplies. They wanted to see him the following Tuesday. On the day in question, mother and son took the train to Nottingham. Mrs. Morel was excited, but Paul was miserable. They found the address they had been given. It was at the end of a dirty street which the sun never touched. At the top of some old stairs was a sign that read, "Thomas Jordan and Son, Hospital Supplies." Paul's heart sunk. They met Mr. Jordan. He was a short little man. After telling Mrs. Morel what Paul's job would be, he handed the boy a letter written in French. Paul took the letter, but could not read most of it, because the handwriting was very bad. Paul was so nervous he could not explain about the handwriting. Mr. Jordan became angry.
"Well, what school did you go to?"
he asked. Paul could say nothing. He hated the little man. Mr. Jordan looked at the mother.
"When could he start?"
he asked. "As soon as you want. He has finished school now," she replied. In the end, Paul was hired as a junior clerk. He felt sick to the stomach thinking about his future, but his mother was pleased that her second boy was also going out into the world. On the next Monday morning, he got up at 6 o'clock to start work. He had his train ticket in his pocket and his lunch in a bag. Mrs. Morel came to the door to see him off. She was proud of her son.
"Good morning, Mother,"
he said, smiling but feeling unhappy. She felt, as she stood watching him go, that where he wanted to go in life, he would get there. She thought of William and how different her two boys were. But now, both were out in the world, in London and Nottingham. They had come from her, and now their works and their lives would also be hers. All morning long she thought of Paul. At 8 o'clock he climbed the stairs to Jordan and Son. He stood just inside the door, not knowing what to do. Only 2 other men had arrived. Paul thought that being on time must not be very important. One of the other clerks came up to him.
"You must be the new boy,"
he said.
"Yes."
said Paul.
"Okay, follow me,"
the clerk instructed Paul. Paul was shown where he was to work. The whole place was dark and dirty. The light came through a big window on the top floor.
"You'll be with Pappleworth. He's your boss. He usually doesn't get here till 8:30, so you have time to get the day's orders,"
he was told. Mr. Pappleworth arrived at 9 o'clock. He was a thin man with a red nose. He was about 36 years old.
"Are you my new boy?"
he asked. Paul stood up and said he was. Mr. Pappleworth spent the next hour telling Paul all the things he had to do. He showed him the other parts of the factory and introduced him to the ladies working on the other floors. It was a lot to learn in such a short time, and Paul felt confused. He was left to make copies of the orders. His writing had always been bad, so it took him a long time to finish each letter.
"Come on, boy,"
said Mr. Pappleworth.
"We'll never get anything done if you keep this up. Can't you move a little faster?"
Paul worked away, but the harder he tried, the worse his writing became. The day was very long. All morning people came to talk with Mr. Pappleworth. Paul was busy writing or learning to make up packages and prepare them for the midday mail. 1 o'clock was lunchtime. Paul ate his lunch alone. At 2, Paul was back at work. Mr. Pappleworth did not return until almost 3. When he did, he sat and talked to Paul, as if he were his equal. Paul enjoyed this very much. He was beginning to like Mr. Pappleworth. In the afternoon there was not much to do. At 5 o'clock all the men went down to the bottom floor to have tea. After tea, all the lights went on and there was work to do. This became Paul's favorite time of day at the factory. He liked the feeling of being part of something larger. It was as if the whole factory became one animal. Men became the job they were doing. There was a sense of a shared goal. At the end of the day, Paul took his bag and headed for the 8:20 train back home. The day in the factory was 12 hours long. His mother sat waiting for him. He had to walk a long way from the train station, so he did not get home until about 20 past 9. He had left before 7 in the morning. Mrs. Morel worried about his health. Yet her life had always been hard, so she felt no need to protect her children from work. Paul came in looking very tired. "How was it?" she asked.
"They say my writing is bad, but other than that it was fine,"
he answered. Paul got used to working at the factory. He came to like the factory girls best. The men seemed rather stupid after a while. It became normal for him to eat his lunch with the girls. He was naturally shy and quiet, but with them he seemed relaxed. The girls all liked to hear him talk and would sit in a circle around him while he told them about books and painting. They thought of him as a strange boy, so serious, yet always laughing when he was around them. They all took him into their hearts. So the time at the factory went happily enough. The factory had a comfortable feel to it, and there wasn't too much work to be done. Paul did, however, like it when work sped up. He liked the sight of all the men and women busy at their jobs. From the train at night, he used to walk home looking at the lights of the town. He felt rich and happy in life during these times. He would see the town settling down for the night and think of all the lives that it contained. People were doing their work, being born, growing up, getting married, raising their children, growing old, and dying. He felt as if he was part of something much bigger than himself. He came to the corner where their house stood. It, too, was a small part of a bigger world. His mother stood up, happy to have him home. He put all his pay on the table.
"It will help a little, Mother,"
he said proudly. "There is not much left after the price of your train ticket and your lunches," she said. Yet she was very pleased with her son, and the little money that he made meant far more to her than what could be bought for it. He was a man now. That's what mattered. Then he would sit and tell his mother all about the day at the factory. She came to know about Mr. Pappleworth and the factory girls. In this way she shared in the life of her son. It was almost as if it was her own life.
Chapter 6. Death in the Family. Arthur Morel was growing up. He was a strong and careless boy, a lot like his father. He hated school and would always take the first chance to escape into the fields. He was the most beautiful of all the children, well-made and full of life. As he grew older, he developed a bad temper. He grew angry over nothing and seemed to be fighting something in himself. His mother, whom he loved, grew tired of him sometimes. He thought only of himself. His father, whom he had loved and who had thought the world of him, he came to hate. So much so that when he was offered a place at the high school in Nottingham, his mother thought it would be best if he lived there. Annie was still a teacher at the local school. She seemed happy in her work and always did what her mother wanted her to do. Mrs. Morel took most interest in Paul. He was still painting, and his mother was still the center of his world. Everything he did was for her. She waited till he came home in the evening, and then she told him about all that had been on her mind during the day. He sat and listened carefully. They shared their lives. William planned to marry the girl he had told his mother about in his letters. He wanted to bring the girl home to meet the family. Mrs. Morel said they should come at Christmas. This time William arrived with the girl, but no presents. The girl was tall, beautiful, and wearing very fine clothes. William introduced her as Jip. Miss Western, for that was her real name, held out her hand to Mrs. Morel and smiled. "Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Morel," she said. "You must be hungry," said Mrs. Morel. "Oh, no, we had dinner on the train," she answered. At that moment Morel came home.
"Hello, Father,"
said William.
"Hello, my son. What have we here?"
asked Morel. William introduced his beautiful girl to his father. She smiled, and all could tell that Morel liked her. Miss Western changed for dinner, and when she returned to the room, Morel jumped out of his chair to offer it to her.
"This chair is the warmest. Come and sit here, young miss,"
he said. "Thank you so much," the girl said, sitting down in the place of honor. Miss Western played the upper-class lady at first acting as if all the family were her servants. Only Morel didn't mind. He watched them go to church on Sunday, dressed in their London clothes. He felt he was the father of a prince and princess. Yet she was just acting this way. She was not the upper class. For a year now she had been a secretary in a London office. After a day or two she started to change her ways. William always wanted Paul or Annie to come with them on their walks. He found it so much more interesting when they came along. William seemed worried and troubled the whole time he was at home. All his strength and money went on keeping this girl. He didn't even have enough money left to take his mother to Nottingham for a day. When they returned to London, Mrs. Morel said nothing, but inside she worried a lot about her son. Paul's half-day off work was on Monday. On a Monday morning in May, as they sat at breakfast, Mrs. Morel suggested they take a trip to see her friend, Mrs. Livers, who lived on a farm near the town. When he came home at lunchtime, his mother was excited.
"Are we going?"
he asked. "I wouldn't miss it for anything," she replied, as happy as a schoolgirl. They went along under the trees that lined the road. He was always telling her about things of interest along the way, flowers, animals, and even places. They walked in the sun and were very happy together. Soon they found a little gate that led to a path surrounded by flowers. At the end of the path was Mrs. Livers' farm. On the front window of the farmhouse, loaves of bread were cooling. Then suddenly, a girl appeared at the front door. She was 14, had dark eyes and dark curly hair. As soon as she appeared, she turned back inside. Then out came Mrs. Livers. "Oh, you've come at last," she said. The two women shook hands. "You are sure we are not causing you any trouble?" asked Mrs. Morel. "Oh, no," replied Mrs. Livers. "We are always happy to have visitors here." They followed her inside. They sat down around the fireplace. The women were talking of old times, so Paul went into the garden to look at the flowers. The girl came out quickly to get something.
"I think these are roses,"
he said. "I don't know," she replied.
"You don't have much in your garden,"
Paul said in a dreamy voice. "This is our first year here," she answered, in a distant way. Paul returned to have tea with his mother and Mrs. Livers. They spent a very enjoyable afternoon, eating, talking, and being shown the farm. When it was time to go, Paul picked a large bunch of flowers for his mother. She smiled when he gave them to her. Mr. and Mrs. Livers walked with them down the path towards home. The afternoon sun made everything around them golden. "It is a beautiful place," said Mrs. Morel. She and Paul went on alone together. As they walked home, the moon came out. Paul's heart was full of happiness and beauty. William came home with his girl again in the summer. The weather was perfect for the whole week of their stay. Yet, the weather did not improve William's state of mind. He still seemed to get angry with his girlfriend over affairs that did not seem important to the others in the family. He was fighting something in himself, and his mother knew it. He tried to explain to her how at times he hated the girl that would be his wife, but could not give her up.
"You know, Mother,"
he would say, when they were alone together at night,
She has no idea of money, and she's so stupid at times. And I think that we are going to be married next year."
"A bad marriage it would be, William. You should think again, my son," his mother told him.
"It has gone too far, much too far,"
was all he could say. After they had returned to London, William wrote many letters to his mother. In them, he seemed confused and lost. Sometimes he would write that he was the happiest he had ever been, and other times he would tell of how miserable he was. He wanted to come home, but he could not get any more holidays. Then he was working more to save money for the wedding. Every letter told of a new plan. One Tuesday morning, a message came from London. William was very sick. Mrs. Morel put on her best clothes, borrowed some money from a neighbor, and took the first train she could. It was 6 o'clock before she reached William's apartment. He was lying on the bed, his eyes red and his face washed of color. She could see that no one had been with him. "My son," she said, in as normal a voice as she could. He did not answer. He looked at her but did not see her. The doctor came. He said it was pneumonia. Mrs. Morel settled down to nurse her son. She prayed during the long night of his sickness. He became worse and worse, sweating and talking in his sleep. Then, at 2 o'clock in the morning, he died. Mrs. Morel sat without moving for more than 2 hours. Then she had a message sent home. "William died last night. Tell father to come with money." Annie, Paul, and Arthur were at home. Mr. Morel had gone to work. The 3 children did not say a word. Annie began to cry, and Paul went to get his father. When Paul told his father what had happened, the words that came out of his mouth did not seem real. Morel could not understand. He could not believe his son was dead. Morel went off, scared and confused, to help his wife. The children were left alone in the house. Paul went to work, Arthur went to school, and Annie stayed home and cried. Mr. and Mrs. Morel returned on Saturday night. They both seemed to not notice what was going on around them. The family sat in the kitchen. No one knew what to do. "The coffin will be here tonight, Walter. You should find some men to help," was all Mrs. Morel could say. Morel and Paul went into the front room to make space for the coffin. At 10 o'clock, Morel called.
"He's here."
All the family was shocked out of their own sad thoughts. 6 men, all miners, came in carrying William's coffin. They walked slowly under the weight. The coffin was finally rested on some chairs in the front room. When the miners left, the family was left alone with the sad truth. "Oh, my son, cried Mrs. Morel. Paul thought the coffin would forever be there in the house. He could not imagine this sorrow ever leaving. They buried him on Monday. After the funeral, Mrs. Morel seemed to lose all interest in life. Her only thought was that it should have been her dead, not her beautiful son. When Paul came home from work at night, he found his mother sitting, her day's work done, staring into the distance. She did not move and she didn't say anything. Paul tried to think of some news to tell her, but everything seemed so unimportant now. Finally he asked her,
"What's the matter, Mother?"
She did not hear him. He asked again. "You know what the matter is," she said angrily. Paul did not know what to do. He worked extra hours to be able to give her more money. He was becoming sick with tiredness and worry. Then, the day before Christmas, he became very sick. Seeing her son this way made Mrs. Morel come back to life. She sent for the doctor. He said it was pneumonia. She hated herself for letting Paul work himself into this state.
I should have watched the living, not the dead, she told herself. Paul was dangerously sick. His mother nursed him day and night. She was not going to lose another son. With all her love, she pulled him back from the edge of death. Slowly, the boy began to improve. Her love had saved him. Paul was in bed for 7 weeks. He was weak for some time still, but the danger had passed. He sat talking to his mother most of the day, happy to see her full of life again. Years later, Paul's aunt said, "In some ways, it was a good thing that Paul was sick that Christmas. I believe it saved his mother." Chapter 7. Boy and Girl Love. Paul had been many times to the Livers' farm. He was becoming friends with the 3 Livers boys, but Miriam, the girl he had seen on his first visit, remained distant. She was a strange girl. The only person she ever really talked to was her mother. She read poetry and always had dreams of a more romantic life. But life on the farm would not let her dream for long. Her brothers treated her as a servant, and she hated them. She was nearly 16 and very beautiful. It was a long time before she would allow herself to speak freely to Paul. The only boys she had ever known were her brothers, and they never took her seriously. Then one day she asked him, "Have you seen the swing?"
"No,"
said Paul.
"Let's go and see it."
In one of the farm buildings was a rope tied to the roof. At the end, it had been tied in a loop so someone could sit in it.
"You go first,"
he said to the girl. "No, I won't go first. You go," she said. For the first time in her young life, she enjoyed giving way to a man. Paul stepped into the swing. He pushed off with great energy. Soon he was flying through the air, back and forth, higher and higher. She watched him in amazement.
"I've had a long enough turn. It's your go,"
he said after a while. He helped her to get started. Miriam felt his hands upon her body. He pushed her off. She flew into the air. When she returned, he was there to catch her and send her off again. Her heart melted in hot pain when the moment came for him to push her forward again. Paul was becoming part of the Livers family. They accepted him, and he felt at home when he was there. Miriam began to feel differently towards him. He was not like her brothers, even though he spent a lot of time with them. He was always a little different. Paul started giving Miriam lessons in mathematics. But things came slowly to her. He got angry at her if she didn't understand what he was trying to teach. "You don't give me enough time to learn it," she said.
"If you say so,"
he would reply, throwing the book on the table. Often, when he would go into the kitchen, Mrs. Livers would look at him and say, "Don't be so hard on Miriam. She may not be quick, but I'm sure she tries."
"I can't help it. I just get angry with her,"
he said, feeling sorry about getting angry.
"You're not angry with me?"
he asked Miriam later. "No," she replied in her beautiful deep voice. "I'm not angry." Then he would often leave Miriam and go off with her brothers. It was painful for Miriam to see this, but she waited for him to come back to her. Paul was now painting more than ever. When he had finished a work, he liked nothing more than to show it to Miriam. From what she said about his paintings, he learned something about himself. She helped him to see what had been there all along. That there was any love growing between them, both would have denied. He thought himself too intelligent for such a thing, and she thought she was above it and did not need men. Miriam was very sensitive. Her work on the farm had shown her all the facts of life. But because of this daily contact with the laws of nature, she had become sickened by the thought of sex. Paul followed her in this matter. When he was 19, he was still earning little money, but he was happy. His painting was going well and life was fine. That Easter, Paul organized for them to take a walk in the mountains. The day was full of light and color. Everyone was in a holiday mood. They had lunch in a field and spent the afternoon exploring the country. Miriam went off by herself for a while. She could not spend too much time in the company of others. She never felt that she was like other people. Because of this, her best friend and lover was nature. She was most at peace when alone in the forest. It was getting late, so she tried to find the others. She came out of the forest onto a road. In the distance, she could see Paul. The sun was setting in front of him. He looked thin and strong, and it seemed as if the sun was giving him to her. A deep pain took hold of her, and she knew she must love him. She had discovered him. The next Sunday, Miriam was upstairs dressing when Paul came. She liked to come running down to meet him. She stood at the foot of the stairs, putting on a necklace he had given her. It got caught in her hair, but she finally got it on. She looked beautiful. Miriam went to stand by the window. Suddenly, she heard the gate open and saw Paul push his bicycle into the yard. She saw him look at the house, and she moved out of view. He walked in a relaxed way, and his bicycle went with him, as if it were a living animal. "Paul is here!" she screamed. She stood waiting for him. As she did, she searched inside herself to see if she really wanted this Paul Morel. She felt there would be some shame in it. Yet, she was afraid to find she did not want him. Then came a new pain. If she did want him, did he already know? But she stopped herself. How could it be wrong to love him? Paul entered and sat down. He didn't seem to notice Miriam. He was talking to some of the family about a painting he had brought to show them. She went into the other room to be alone. It was lunchtime before she was able to speak to Paul, and then she was so distant that he thought he must have done something that angered her. He did not want to become Miriam's lover. Their relationship had always been for him an intellectual one. He told anyone who asked that they were just friends. If Miriam was there, she remained silent and nodded her head in agreement. He was a fool who did not know his own heart, yet both chose to ignore the talk of others.
"We aren't lovers, we are friends,"
he said to her.
"We know it. Let them talk. What does it matter what they say?"
Sometimes when they were walking together, she would put her arm around his, but this always angered him. With Miriam, he was always trying to explore his own mind. When she did something like that, it destroyed his thoughts. One summer evening, Miriam came to the house. Paul was alone in the kitchen.
"Come and have a look at the flowers,"
he said. He picked her some flowers. He pinned them onto her dress, stepping back to see how they looked. Miriam laughed. No other man would take pinning flowers onto a dress so seriously. He had nearly finished getting the flowers exactly how he wanted them, when he heard his mother coming.
"Don't tell Mother,"
he said. Miriam stood looking at the sunset. She would visit him no more, she thought. "Good evening, Mrs. Morel," she said, sounding as if she were a stranger. "Oh, it's you, Miriam," replied Mrs. Morel coldly. But Paul wanted everyone to accept his friendship with this girl for what he thought it was. Mrs. Morel knew better. It was not until he was 20 years old that the family could pay to go away for a holiday. Now at last Paul had saved enough money, and they were all going. There was to be a big group, some of Annie's friends, one of Paul's, and Miriam. It was a great excitement looking for places to go. They decided on a town by the sea called Mablethorpe. They were to leave early on the Saturday morning, so Miriam came to stay the night at the house. Paul had found a poem about the town they were to visit, so he read it to the family. Miriam sat staring at him. He was her whole world. Mrs. Morel sat jealously on her own chair. After dinner, Miriam went to help clean up. "Let me help clean up," she said. "Certainly not," said Annie. "You sit down again." So Miriam did what she was told and sat down. All the women, whether they knew it or not, were fighting for Paul's attention, and they each did this in the way they thought best. When they arrived at the house they had rented, they were all very happy. It was away from any other house, and it had a view of the sea. Miriam did not get to have Paul to herself much during the holiday. It was only when at night the others went to town, and Paul stayed to paint, that he was all hers. He talked to her endlessly about ideas and painting. One night they went for a walk along the beach. It was a warm and beautiful night. There was no one else in sight, and the only noise was the noise of the sea. Paul loved listening to the sea. It was late when they turned around and started for home. Paul and Miriam walked in silence. Suddenly he stopped. A large orange moon was staring at them. His heart beat very fast and his blood ran hot. She was there with him under this beautiful sky. He felt confused and sad. He did not understand the feelings in his heart. That was the problem. He was afraid of her. The fact that he might want her, as a man wants a woman, scared him, and she was too sensitive to stand the shock of physical love, even a strong kiss. The kiss he was too scared to give. He hated her, for she seemed to make him hate himself. They walked home in silence. He thought of his mother and the other happy people back at the house. Their lives didn't seem so troubled. They loved and laughed without a care, he thought. Would he always be so unhappy? And what was it about this girl that could make him feel so bad about himself? Chapter 8. Trouble in Love. Paul had 2 of his paintings shown at an art show. He won first prize for both. He was very excited when he told his mother the news. She was full of joy. William had given her his sporting trophies. She still kept them and never forgot his death for even a moment. Young Arthur was handsome, warm, and generous, and probably would do well one day. But Paul was going to be something special, she thought. She had a great belief in him, partly because he didn't know his own powers. There was so much that came out of his mind and heart. The future seemed rich for her son. She was to succeed in the end. Her struggle had not been wasted. Several times during the art show, Mrs. Morel walked around without telling Paul. She walked down the long room and looked at the other paintings. Yes, they were good, but they did not have what she thought of as greatness. She looked at them a long time, trying to find mistakes in them. Then, suddenly, her heart beat faster. There was Paul's painting. She knew it by heart. Name: Paul Morel, first prize, the sign under the painting read. It looked so strange, there in public, hanging on the walls where she had seen so many pictures in her lifetime. She felt a proud woman. When she met well-dressed ladies going home, she thought to herself, "Yes, you look nice, but does your son have 2 first prizes at the art show?" Paul felt he had done something for her, even if it was only small. All his work was for her. One day, going to the art show, he met Miriam. She was walking with a very beautiful blonde woman. Miriam looked at Paul to try to see what he was thinking, but his eyes were on the blonde stranger. Miriam saw the man in him raise its head.
"I didn't know you were coming to town,"
he said to Miriam. "I didn't know myself until the last minute," Miriam said.
He looked at the blonde woman again. "I've told you about Mrs. Dawes," said Miriam. "Clara, do you know Paul?" "I think I've seen him before," she said, not taking much interest. The women left. Paul remembered that Clara Dawes was the daughter of an old friend of Mrs. Liver's. She was separated from her husband and had taken up the cause of women's rights. She was said to be intelligent. Paul was interested. The next time Paul went to see Miriam, it was Saturday evening. There was a fire in the front room. She was waiting for him. 3 of Paul's paintings hung on the walls. He sat in a chair while she sat at his feet. "What did you think of Mrs. Dawes?" she asked.
She doesn't look very friendly,
he replied. "No, but do you think she's beautiful?" she asked.
Yes, in a way,
he said. There was silence for a moment while he thought of Clara. "What do you like about her?" asked Miriam.
Her skin and the look of bravery she has. I looked at her through the eyes of an artist, that's all.
They were silent. The sadness between them excited her. He seemed so beautiful with his eyes gone so dark and looking like they were deeper than the deepest well. She wanted to reach out to him, but could not. When it was time to go, he found that the tire on his bike had no air in it. He set to work fixing it. Miriam watched him work. She loved to see him doing things with his hands. He was thin and strong, with relaxed movements. Busy in his work, he forgot that she was there. She loved him completely. She wanted to run her hands over his body. She always wanted to touch him, so long as he didn't want her. When he finished fixing the bicycle, he stood up. His back was to her. She put her hands on his sides and ran them quickly down. "You are so fine," she said. He laughed, hating her. But his blood went red-hot with the touch of her hands. Quickly he got on his bike and rode away. About this time he was 21 and she was 20. He began to question his religion. He challenged Miriam on all her beliefs. Miriam suffered a lot under his attacks. His intelligence was like a knife, and it was cutting apart her religion. The man she loved was bleeding her dry. It was also at about this time that Mrs. Morel began to dislike Miriam. She thought that Miriam wanted too much of Paul. Her fear was that if he gave himself to her, he would leave nothing left. He would never be a whole man with her. She would be too much for him. One day he asked his mother,
"Why don't you like her, Mother?"
"I don't know, my boy," she said. "I've tried, but I can't." Spring was the worst time. He felt angry and sad in turns. He decided to stay away from her. Then came the hours when he knew Miriam was expecting him. His mother would watch him grow restless. He couldn't paint. He could do nothing. It was as if some unseen power was drawing him towards her. He could not stop himself any longer. He went out. On the way he felt happy, but when he was with her he felt the old anger. They walked part of the way home together. The stars were shining brightly. It was a beautiful night, but they were both too trapped in their thoughts to notice. When it was time to part, he said to her,
"You know it's only friendship, don't you?"
She was hurt, but more for him than for herself. She was sorry that he could be so dishonest with himself, and she worried that if he could not be, she would lose him forever. She still came to the house for her French lessons on Friday nights. When they had something to busy themselves with, like a French lesson, they both loved being together. Morel was always happy on Friday nights, unless the week's pay was small. He wanted his dinner as soon as he entered the house. After eating, he went to wash. When he had finished, he returned to the kitchen.
"Where's my towel?"
he asked his wife. "Here it is," she said, handing it to him.
A skinny rabbit like me could freeze to death washing in this weather,
he said. Mrs. Morel laughed. He still had a wonderfully young body without any fat. His skin was smooth and clear. It could have been the body of a 28-year-old, except for the blue scars where the dust from the mine stayed under the skin. He put his hands on his side, showing that he was too thin. It was still his belief that because he did not get fat, he was as thin as a little rabbit. The French lesson continued. Miriam took out her book, in which she had done the work from the last lesson. She was always very shy at these times, afraid that he would find too many mistakes. She watched his hand moving so quickly across her work. He could feel her across the table. He knew she loved him. He was afraid of her love for him. It was too good to him. He was not worth it. His love was at fault, not hers. Sadly, he corrected her work. She sat and waited for him to finish. She bent forward to see what he was doing. As she did, her hair touched his face. He jumped back as if he had been burned. His breathing became quick. Her eyes showed her love and her fear. He knew that before he could kiss her, he must kill something inside himself. Knowing this, he hated her a little. He continued to look at her work.
Okay, it's getting late. Should we finish, or do you want to read a bit?
He asked her. Maybe we could read a little, she answered. She thought there was nothing better in the world than to hear him read. It was food for her love. He made a copy of a poem for her, then read it to her. His voice was soft and rich. But as he read more of the poem, a sharp edge came into his voice. She felt pain, as if the sound of his voice was cutting into her body. She did not understand why he had to become so angry. There was so much pain inside him that even though she would have given the world to make him feel happy, she seemed to only make him feel worse. He finished the poem and went into the kitchen. Miriam looked at the bookcase. She saw the postcards and letters he had been sent. She saw his books. One interested her, so she took it out to look at it. He returned from the kitchen, and they set off towards Miriam's house. He did not return home until 11 o'clock. His mother was sitting by the fire. Annie was sitting with her. Paul entered quietly. No one spoke. His mother was reading the newspaper. He took off his coat and went to sit with them. Still, no one spoke. He was very uncomfortable. He could tell that his mother was angry with him, but he did not know why. Paul sat pretending to read. If his mother was angry, he wanted to know why. So, instead of going to bed, which he would have liked to do, he sat and waited. Still there was silence. The clock was the loudest sound in the room. "If you want something to eat, you will have to get it yourself," she said finally.
I don't want anything,
he replied. He was hungry, but he was too angry to do anything that she suggested. With all his troubled thoughts over Miriam, he thought that at least when he was home, he should be able to feel relaxed. He took off his tie and stood up to go to bed. He bent over to kiss his mother. She threw her arms around him and started to cry. "I can't stand it. Any other woman, but not her. She would leave me no room, nothing," she cried. He put his hand on her head to comfort her.
I don't love her, Mother,
he said. He kissed her and went to bed. Chapter 9. The Defeat of Miriam. Paul was unhappy with himself and with everything. The deepest of his love belonged to his mother. The thought that he had hurt her caused him great pain. It was spring, and there was a battle between Paul and Miriam. At the bottom of her heart, she believed he would never be hers. She could not see the two of them living happily together for the rest of their lives. Sorrow was all she could see. The holidays began happily. Paul was his old self, but Miriam felt that it was only a matter of time before he would become the angry young man that her love made him. One Sunday afternoon, she stood at her bedroom window, looking out across the fields. Everything was new and green with the spring. She heard the gate open and knew it was Paul. By now she knew him so well that she could tell what was going on inside of him by how he looked. Today he was not happy. She came to meet him with a heavy heart. He said very little. They went into the garden to be alone. His eyes looked coldly at her. She thought it cruel that his eyes, which she loved so much, could hurt her so deeply. They walked in silence. Miriam picked some flowers. She touched them to her face and lips. Their beauty filled her.
Can you never leave things alone? Must you pull the heart out of everything?
He said suddenly. She looked up at him, full of pain. She kept the flower pressed to her lips. Their touch was so much kinder than his words.
You are always asking for love. You even want the flowers to love you. You don't love, but you need to be loved because you have something missing inside you,
he said, not knowing where his words were coming from. She said nothing. They walked out of the garden and into the fields. After a while they sat down with their backs against a tree. Paul dug at the ground with a stick.
I can only give friendship, that is all. It's something in my nature,
he said, after 5 minutes' silence. She was trying to be patient with him. She knew he loved her. He belonged to her, his body as well as his mind. Something inside him just had to give way, and then he could know his true self. She guessed that it was not only Paul himself that was the problem. Someone was working against his love. It did not take her long to know who that was. Mrs. Morel was sure it was Paul that was going to prove her right. He was going to become the type of man that changes the world. Then her life would be a victory. Wherever he went and whatever he did, her thoughts were with him. She hated it when he was with Miriam. William was dead. She was going to fight for Paul. He had come back to her. His mind was made much easier by his return to her. She was the first woman to love him, and she was the first woman he loved, but his young life was fighting towards something else. His mother knew this, and wished that Miriam were the type of girl who could take the new part of him, but leave her the son she loved. It was a week before he went to see Miriam again. She had been suffering a great deal. She was afraid to see him again. Would he leave her? He would always come back, she told herself, but for now he would battle against her love. They sat in the garden reading.
We spend so much time together. People will think we're getting married. I don't think it's fair to you because I don't love you like a man should love his wife. What do you think?
He asked. I don't know, she said sadly.
Do you think we love each other enough to marry?
He asked in a hard voice. No, she answered truthfully. We're too young.
I thought that I could never give you what you gave me. I still do. But if you want to get married, then we will,
he told her. Now Miriam wanted to cry. She did not know why he had to play these games. Why couldn't he just be himself? This is your mother talking. I know she never liked me, she said.
No. She simply told me that if I keep seeing you as much as I have been, then I should think of myself as married,
he explained. There was silence. They both knew that they would keep seeing each other, but from now on things would be a little different. There would be a space between them, a space created by his mother, thought Miriam. She wished Mrs. Morel would mind her own business. 2 days later he sent her a book and a little note, telling her to read and keep busy. She could not stop thinking about what had happened. There was something else he wanted. he could never be happy. He could never give her peace. If she could not prove to him that his happiness lay with her, then there would always be something to cause trouble between them. She could not make the trouble go away. All she could do was hope. In May, she asked him to come to the farm to meet Mrs. Dawes. She knew he wanted her. Whenever they had spoken of her, she saw his eyes light up. He denied that he had any interest in the older woman. She was going to put him to the test. It was her belief that he was split between the finer things in life and the lower. She thought of herself as being the finer and believed that in the end he would choose her. He was excited to be meeting Clara again. Clara was looking very beautiful on the day they met. She made everything around her seem ugly and poor. Miriam could sense Paul's happiness when he was near her. Clara sat leaning on the table. He noticed that her hands were large but perfectly formed. Her skin was white and it was covered in little golden hairs. Clara took no notice of Paul. If she did say something to him, it was to disagree with what he had said. He talked to Miriam for a while. Clara sat staring into space. It was as if she needed no one else in her world. She was enough for herself. Paul left after a short time. He was hurt and confused. He walked alone for an hour before he returned for lunch. During lunch, she continued to appear to be in her own little world. The others spoke of the farm. After lunch, Mrs. Livers asked Clara, "Are you happier now?" "Much," Clara answered. "You don't miss your husband now that he is gone?" continued Mrs. Livers. "So long as I can be free, I am happy," Clara said. Paul felt as if he should not be hearing any of this. He stood up to leave the table and said,
"I think you'll find that it is a lot harder to leave things behind than you seem to think."
Clara did not answer him. He went out to the garden to be alone. Later, Paul, Miriam, and Clara went for a walk together. Miriam noticed that everything they said to each other was to disagree with what the other had said. All afternoon they fought with words. The more they did, the kinder Paul was to Miriam. He picked her flowers and said kind things to her. She thought that her plan was working, but she was too young to know that sometimes two people will find the heat of passion through the heat of argument. All that afternoon, they tried to find the other's weakness. Neither succeeded, but there would be other times. Both of them knew that. Miriam did not. About this time, Annie was married. She seemed very happy, but the rest of the family did not like the man that was to be her husband. Still, they all went along to the wedding and wished her well. She was sad to be leaving the family home. She cried for days before the wedding, but in the end she went off to start her new life. After the wedding, Mrs. Morel sat thinking about her children. She hoped that Annie would have a happier marriage than she did. Arthur was now in the army, and she knew that he hated it. And Paul seemed to be trapped in his own thoughts. She felt that she must stay strong, so she could guide her children to their happiness. Paul felt life changing around him. He was a man now. Annie and Arthur had left the house. He stayed, but felt something moving inside him. Sometimes he would meet Clara in Nottingham. When he was with her, he felt as if he was in a larger, more interesting world. She challenged him and made him feel alive. Miriam came to see that Paul could choose the lower path in life. He could be untrue to himself. She feared that he could become a man who chases after the easy joys of life, not the pure and true things that she thought were the real Paul Morel. She could not talk to him like Clara talked to him, but she felt that she could give him something much more valuable. Paul could take no more. He felt that Miriam was too good for him. He could never live up to the idea she had of him. He knew that part of him wanted those better things in life, and that part of him longed for Miriam.
But he also knew that most of him simply wanted to live life. When she was 21, he wrote her a letter. He told her that he could not be her man, as he would always fail her. They were joined at the mind, but life was so much more than that. So if either of them were to fully live, they would have to find other people to love. She read the letter twice before putting it away. She believed that from now on her life would be without love and without any happiness. This was the end of the first part of Paul's love affair. He was now 23 years old. He had not yet shared a bed with a woman. Miriam had stopped his natural desires, but now they returned. Often when he was with Clara, he could feel his blood grow thick with desire. A new world opened before his eyes.
Chapter 10. Clara. Paul and his mother now had long talks about life. Religion was no longer a part in the young man's life. He had thrown away all the ideas that could stop him from living the life he wanted to live. In the past, ideas had been the most powerful force in his life, but now, life itself was what made his heart come alive. Mrs. Morel tried to keep him from becoming too excited by his new sense of life. He still had not stopped thinking about Miriam, and she saw that this took much of his energy. She also knew that he was becoming very interested in Clara, an older woman. She could only cause her son pain. "My boy," she told him, "all your intelligence, your leaving behind of old things, and your new feeling for life, they all don't seem to bring you much happiness."
"What is happiness?"
he cried.
"It's nothing to me. How am I ever to be happy?"
Mrs. Morel was troubled by his hopelessness. "That's for you to decide, my son. But if you could meet some good woman who would make you happy, you could settle down. It would be much better for you," she told him. She had hurt him. All the pain he felt over Miriam came to the surface.
"You mean easy. That's all a woman wants, an easy life, comfortable, and with nothing to worry about. I hate that thought. I don't care if I am happy or not. I want my life to be full. That is the only way to truly live,"
he told her. "You have never given it a chance. You should care. You should try to live a happy life. The thought of you being unhappy forever breaks my heart," she said, almost crying. Mrs. Morel wanted to save her son. He was killing himself with his own pain. She hated Miriam for having taken away his joy. She knew that Miriam did not want to do it, but she had. She wished that he would fall in love with a girl who would make him strong again. The months went slowly by. One day, a friend from Nottingham asked him to take a message to Clara. She lived in a house on a small, dirty street. The house itself was old and looked as though a strong wind would blow it down. She answered the door when he knocked. They both felt strange to be meeting at her house. Whenever they had met before, it was in public, or where there were other people. Inside, the rooms were covered with clothes and books. Clara tried to clean up a little, but it was no use. She asked him to sit. "Would you like a bottle of beer?" she asked him. He said yes, even though he did not usually drink. He sat with his beer and watched her work around the house. He noticed her body and the way it moved. She was like something from a half-remembered dream. He could not put into words the feeling she caused in him. Confusion and excitement battled in his brain. Paul felt as if his eyes were opening. As she continued to work, he felt that he wanted her to ask him for help. He wanted to give her what she needed. It made him sad to see her in such a small and dirty place. She was life, and she should not be spending her days shut away. When he left her, he wanted to run. He went to the train station in a kind of dream and was home before he realized. Clara had educated herself.
She had left school at an early age to work and later get married. But in the last 5 years she had read everything she could find. She had taught herself French and knew about most of the important writers. None of this did she tell Paul. She liked to hide her true self from the world. Sometimes Paul caught her looking at people in a strange way. It was almost like she could see into their true selves, and was always sad at what she saw there. Paul would look into her eyes, but they revealed nothing. She would smile and walk away. He wanted to know what lay beneath. One day, he found a book of French poetry on her table.
"You read French, do you?"
he asked excitedly. She was sitting by the window sewing. The afternoon sun made her blonde hair come alive. Her neck and arms caught the light and seemed to send it back even brighter. "What did you say?" she asked, smiling. Paul's blood boiled. She wasn't even listening to him.
"I did not know you read French,"
he said in a quiet voice. "You never asked," she replied. He was quiet. He watched her work. She seemed to hate work of any kind, yet always what she made was perfect. He was amazed that she could be so cold. He was always hot and angry, troubled over everything in life. She must be something very special, he thought.
"What would you do if you could do anything?"
he asked. "There is little chance that I will ever get that chance, so I don't waste my time thinking about it," she answered. "You only ask that because you think you are too good to be working in a factory, like most people have to do their whole lives. You think that you are a great artist and that it is below you to waste your days with anything but art. But here is some news for you. Most people don't care about art. They don't care about what you think is the only reason for living. The world does not owe you anything, Paul. The sooner you understand that, the better off you will be." He was angry and very hurt.
"But I don't think that I am too good to work in a factory. It's the opposite. I think that that is where real life happens, and that is what I want to paint,"
he said, trying to defend himself. "But you don't live that life. You only use it to show what you think life is. For the people you work beside, that is life, nothing more. They are living. You are thinking about living," she said. He did not know what to say. For days after he tried to think of an answer to what she had said, but his mind was in a storm. Was she right, or was she hiding her own sorrows by hurting him? After a week, Paul received a package in the mail. It was from Clara. He opened it not knowing what to expect. It was a book of poetry with a note inside. "Please accept this small gift. It will make me feel less alone if you do. I wish you the best of luck. C.D."
"Clara, she can't afford to buy me gifts. Who would ever have thought it?"
he said, very excited. He was filled with warmth for her. It was like she was there with him. He could almost feel her beautiful body touching his. Sending him the book had brought them closer together. One day in October they were walking together. Clara stopped at the top of a hill and sat down. She seemed to be lost in thought. Paul sat beside her and was quiet for a time.
"How old were you when you got married?"
he asked quietly, after some minutes. 22, she answered.
"That was 8 years ago,"
he said. "Yes."
"And when did you leave him?"
he asked. 3 years ago, she answered.
5 years. Did you love him when you married him?
She was quiet for a long time. "I thought I did. I don't think about it much any more. He really wanted me," she said.
"You seem to have gone into it without thinking,"
he replied. "Yes, I think that is true. I have been asleep nearly all my life," she said in a dreamy voice. It was a beautiful afternoon. The sun was setting, and everything seemed to be at peace. They sat in silence for a long time, both thinking about how life plays painful games with people. Suddenly, Paul jumped up.
"Come on,"
he said.
"Let's go and get some tea."
They found a quiet place and sat down to tea. She said nothing still. After tea, she sat looking at her wedding ring. She took it off and put it on the table. Paul watched her. She was so much more alive than he was, he thought. But she was a married woman. It could only ever be friendship. Sex had become such a difficult thing in his mind that he could never imagine having Clara or Miriam or anyone he knew. He had thought too much about it. He loved Miriam with his mind, and if he ever got married, it would be to her. But he could not honestly say that he wanted her sexually. Clara made him feel alive, and he knew all the shapes of her body, but he thought her beautiful through the eyes of a painter, not a lover. He saw Clara as often as he could. It was when he was with her that life seemed at his best. Through the winter he was less unhappy, and his mother was happy to see it. She still worried about her son, and she knew that he could have no future with Clara, but for the time being she made his life better. So Mrs. Morel said nothing against her. All this time Miriam still hoped that the best in her would win in the end. She knew how much he thought of Clara, but she still believed that he would return to her. She was the only one that could make the true Paul happy. Chapter 11. The Test of Miriam. When the spring came again, Paul felt his old feelings rise to the surface. He knew that he would have to see Miriam, but part of him did not want to see her again. It was afraid of the memory of the pain she had caused. He told himself that it had all come from both of their weaknesses. He could have married her, but his life at home took most of his energy. And he did not really want to get married. Marriage was for life, and he did not feel ready to give away his life. He wished that he did. It would make everything so much easier, but something inside him stopped it. When he had been with Miriam, he had felt trapped inside himself. Why couldn't he come out of himself, go to her, and make love to her? Clara had even said that Miriam wanted him to do just that. So why couldn't he? He looked at the other men around him. Most were comfortable with themselves and with women. Yet he was so sensitive with women. He would rather be alone than to cause them pain. He had grown up in a house where his father had caused great pain to his mother, and he now thought that that was the reason why he could not bear the thought of causing a woman pain. In this way, all women had come to be his mother. To hurt any of them was to hurt her, and he had seen her suffer enough. He went back to Miriam. Something in her, when he looked at her, made him cry. She opened herself up so much to him that he felt she gave him too much power over her. He did not deserve it. Mrs. Morel saw him going again to Miriam's farm. She could not understand why. If he came home late, she would look sad and say to him, "Must she keep you this late?"
"It is I who stay,"
he would reply. Miriam was full of love for him. Her love had not lessened over the time he had spent away. If anything, it had grown larger. When she looked at his brown eyes that were full of sorrow, she felt sorry for him. It was harder for him. He was the one that did not know his own mind. She felt that she could go through any amount of suffering for him. One day, as they were sitting together reading, he took her hand and kissed it. He did not know what he was doing, but he bent forward and kissed her lips. Their eyes stayed open, and she saw that, as he kissed her, he stared across the room at the window. He sat back and stayed very still. His heart was beating very fast. "What are you thinking?" she asked.
"I was thinking that I have loved you the whole time,"
he answered. She put her head on his chest. "Yes," she said. She lifted her head and looked into his eyes with all the love she had. "Kiss me," she said. He closed his eyes and kissed her. When she walked home with him over the fields, he said,
"I am happy I came back to you. I feel so simple when I'm with you, and that there is nothing to hide. Do you think we will be happy?"
"Yes," she said, with tears in her eyes. Miriam walked home, not seeing anything. There was so much on her mind. She did not care what other people thought. If he wanted her body, he could have it. But she was afraid. What if she did not please him? What if she was not enough for him, and he went away? He was so much more than other men, but at heart he was still just a man, and wanted what all men want. But she knew that to keep him now, she would have to give herself. She decided that if that was what would make him happy, then she would give him that, because making him happy is what she wanted most of all. He treated her now like a lover. His eyes were full of desire. But she wanted them to be full of love. Their battle was far from over. At this time, Miriam's grandmother became sick. She was sent to a hospital in town, so Miriam went to look after her house. It was a beautiful little house, and Miriam enjoyed her days. Paul planned to come on the next Monday. It was perfect weather. He got to the grandmother's house at about 11 o'clock. Miriam was busy making lunch. He kissed her and sat down to watch. The house was theirs for the day, and they felt like they were man and wife. They went for a walk after lunch. The sun was shining and the fields were full of life.
"I have never seen anything more beautiful than this,"
he said, holding her hand. "It's a great day," she replied.
"Our day, just us,"
he said. They returned to the house. He locked the door, and the house became their private world. He would never forget seeing her stretched out on the bed. She had the most beautiful body he had ever imagined. He stood, unable to move or speak, and drank her beauty in. Then he wanted her. Her big brown eyes were watching him. She lay on the bed, ready to give herself up.
"Are you sure you want me?"
he asked. "Very sure," she answered. She lay there because she loved him. Paul knew that, and for a second he wished he were dead. He closed his eyes, and all he could hear was his blood rushing through his body. Then he took her. He took her and loved her with every part of himself. But he wanted somehow to cry. He stayed with her until late in the night. As he rode home, he felt that finally he had become a man. But why did he feel so sad? He spent every day of that week with her. They loved each other before. Now they learned to love each other's bodies. It was Paul who always began their love-making. Miriam waited for him. Afterwards, there was still the feeling of failure and death.
"When I come to you, you don't really want me, do you?"
he asked her. I do, she said. "I believe, like you do, that loving, even in that way, is the best thing in life."
"But why do you never seem to want it? You take it, but you don't want it."
He said. "Don't say that. I want your children," she said, almost in tears.
"But not me,"
he said sadly. After a week of love, he said to his mother one Sunday night, just as they were going to bed,
"I will not go so often to Miriam's mother's house any more."
She was surprised, but she would not ask him anything. "Please yourself," she said. There was a new quietness about him that she worried about. She thought she knew why, but she also knew that there was nothing she could do about it. He continued to be faithful to Miriam. For one day he had truly loved her, but it never came again. The feeling of failure grew stronger. At first it was only sadness. Then he began to feel that he could not go on. He wanted to run away. He began to stop asking her for her body. It had not brought them closer. It had only pulled them apart. There was no use trying. It would never work between them. For some months he had seen very little of Clara. Sometimes they had taken a short walk, but he kept most of himself from Miriam. With Clara he did not feel sad. She treated him as if he were her child. Without knowing it, the freedom he felt when he was with Clara was pulling him away from Miriam. He felt responsible for Miriam, but he felt Clara was responsible for him. Paul and Miriam went on this way for months. He hated her most of the time, and would then hate himself for doing so. When he was with her, he felt all his weaknesses come to the surface. He felt that the love between them was a sign of both their faults. At last he spoke. He was sitting at home one night with his mother, who had known for months that he was not going to stay with Miriam. He had been unable to sit still all night and was now standing at the door, looking out at the night. "You should go to bed, my boy," said Mrs. Morel. He turned around and said in a quiet voice,
"I am going to end things with Miriam."
She looked up at him. His eyes were on fire. "But I thought you were feeling happier," she said.
"I don't love her. I don't want to marry her, so I will end it,"
he replied. "I have said nothing, because I thought your mind was made. I thought you wanted her," she said carefully.
I wanted to, but it is no good. I must end it,"
he said. "I think it will be for the best," she said. "You have never really been happy with her, and a life of unhappiness is the most terrible thing." He went the next day to see Miriam. She met him at the front gate. She was wearing a little white dress, and she looked very beautiful. They sat down together in the fields. Miriam could sense that he had something on his mind.
"I have been thinking,"
he said.
"We should end this."
"Why?" she asked.
"Because it's no good. I don't want to ever get married, and if we are not going to get married, then there is no point going on,"
he answered. "But why do you say this now, after all these months?"
"Because I've made up my mind,"
he said in a hard voice. They were quiet. Miriam saw him now as a stupid child, a child that drinks all he wants and then throws away the cup. She had for so long tried to reach him. She had given herself to him, and it was still not enough. She began to cry. "You are nothing but a child," she screamed. He did not answer. If she was going to act this way, then he would let her. All he wanted now was to be gone. "Well, what do you want to do?" she asked angrily.
"I simply want this to end. We have lived our lives together for so many years. I will go my way and you will go yours. We will live separate lives,"
he said. All the pain that he had caused her over the years now came rushing out. Miriam screamed at him and told him all that she thought was bad and weak about him. Paul was amazed at the amount of pain that was inside her. He had always thought that only he had a troubled mind. So their love was never as strong as he had thought? Why hadn't she told him? It had only gone on so long because Paul thought that it was only himself that he had to convince. But now he realized that she had been holding back her true feelings. There was nothing left to say. Paul stood up to walk home. "Shall we see each other?" she asked.
"I don't think it's a good idea if we do. I'm sure we will run into each other from time to time, but you should try to start a new life without me,"
he answered. "I see," she said, with angry tears rolling down her face. For the next few weeks, Paul felt nothing. He was at the stage where you can feel no more pain. Now that he knew what Miriam had really thought about him, he began to see their love very differently. After a while he invited Clara to have dinner with him. She was the same as she had always been. But now the feeling she caused in him had changed. He was no longer so afraid of her. After their dinner, they walked through a park leading towards the train station. It was dark in the park, and they were not saying anything. Suddenly, Paul took her in his arms and kissed her. She was surprised, but then she started to kiss him back. They did not say anything. At the train station they wished each other good night and went home, each filled with new and exciting thoughts. Chapter 12. Passion. It was becoming possible for Paul to earn enough money to live by painting alone. He had sold many paintings over the past year, and many people in the art world were starting to mention his name when they talked about the painters of the future. He was 24 when he said to his mother,
"I'll become a great painter one day."
His mother smiled, but said nothing. Inside, she was very happy to see him aiming for greatness. All his thoughts, if they were not about painting, were about Clara. They had grown close since his break with Miriam. It had happened without either of them planning it, but without trying, they had become the closest person in each other's lives. The hours when he was not with her went very slowly. As soon as he left her, he could not wait until they met again. His heart would quicken at the thought of her. One day they were sitting together on the train to Nottingham. She leaned her shoulder against him. He took her hand. He felt himself waking from a long sleep. Her ear, hidden in the long blonde hair, was very near to him. All he wanted to do was kiss it, but the train was full of other people. He looked away. She was moving with the motion of the train. Her body was rubbing against his. He held her hand very tightly and tried to send all his feeling through it to her. Clara turned her head and looked at him. "What happened with Miriam?" she asked.
"I left her,"
he answered. "But I thought you two had been together for years," Clara replied.
"We had been, but I decided that I did not want to marry her, so I thought it was best if I ended it,"
he said. "And now you don't want anything to do with her?" she asked.
"No, it's no good,"
he answered, feeling more and more helpless. They were quiet. They spent some minutes looking out at the country moving by them. It was raining, and the view from the train window put them both in a thoughtful mood. "How old are you?" Clara asked, breaking the silence.
25,
he answered. "And I am 30, she said, soon to be 31.
"I didn't know, and I don't care. What does it matter?"
he said. They left the train and walked towards the hills. Their plan was to walk to the river. Paul thought the rain would have made the road muddy, but Clara still wanted to go. He let her have her way. When they got near the river, they could see that it was flooded. They took off their shoes and kept walking. The rain was getting heavier. It had made them both very wet. Clara's clothes stuck to her body. Paul could see the beautiful lines of her figure. As they were making their way through some trees, Clara slipped. Paul helped her to get up. She was in his arms, their wet bodies pressing against each other. They kissed. She pulled away and ran ahead. Paul ran after her. She was laughing like a schoolgirl. He caught her and kissed her neck. They were both very excited. They made it to the top of a hill. Paul had dropped their shoes in the mud, and he was kneeling down trying to clean them. She put her fingers in his hair, pulled his head towards her, and kissed him.
"What am I meant to be doing? Cleaning shoes or falling in love? Answer me that,"
he said, laughing. "Whatever you want, my dear," she said. In the train on the way home, Paul was as happy as he had ever been. All the other people looked great, and the night was perfect. Everything was good. Mrs. Morel was sitting reading when he got home. Her health was not good now, and she was beginning to look very old. "You are late," she said as he came through the door.
"I know, Mother, but today it is worth it,"
he said. "She must be a very special woman, my son, to make you feel so happy. But I am worried. She is a married woman, after all. What will people say?" she asked.
"I don't care what people say, Mother. She no longer lives with her husband, and it has been that way for many years,"
he said, defending his love. There was silence for a while. He wanted to ask her something, but he was afraid.
"Would you like to meet her?"
he asked finally. "Yes," said Mrs. Morel. "I would like to know what she is like."
"Then, if you don't mind, I will bring her for lunch one Sunday,"
he said. "I don't mind. And what difference would it make if I did?" she said, knowing her son all too well. One day in town he met Miriam walking down the street. They began talking, and the conversation turned to Clara, then to marriage. It hurt Miriam a great deal to talk about those things with him, but he did not notice. He was so caught up in his love for Clara that the rest of the world had become distant.
"You see,"
he said,
"she never understood the importance of marriage. She was so young that she thought nothing in life was forever. Then she grew up and learned about the world. It was then that she saw her husband for what he was."
"She left him because he didn't understand her?" Miriam asked.
"I think so. She had to leave him. It is more than a question of understanding. It is a question of living. With him, she was only living half her life. The rest of her was dead,"
he said. "And what about him?" she asked.
"Maybe he loved her the best he could, but he was a fool who did not know anything,"
he answered. "It sounds like your mother and father," she said carefully.
"In a way, but I believe my mother had real love for my father at first. That is why she stayed with him. That is the important thing, I think, to have real love, real passion,"
he said. Miriam thought about this after they had said goodbye. She saw that that was what he wanted, a love that went beyond the normal type of love. He wanted passion. He wanted an artist's love. She knew that he would never be happy until he had it. Perhaps he needed to feel different kinds of love before he could settle for one. It hurt her to think that he loved another woman, but if that is what he needed to do in order to be happy, then she felt he must. On the next Sunday, he went to meet Clara at the train station. She was laughing as she put her hand out to him. Their eyes met. They walked quickly away from the train station. He had to use all his strength to stop his feelings for her from showing themselves. She looked beautiful. It was as if the sun shone just for her. He felt great pride to be walking next to her. As they walked over the fields, he picked some flowers and put them into her hat. As she watched his hands move, it was as if she were seeing him for the first time. Until then, everything had been unclear. As they neared the house, she became quiet. It did not enter his mind that she might be worried about meeting his family. To him, she seemed capable of anything. Mrs. Morel sat in her chair. She was trying to remain as calm as she could.
"Mother, this is Clara,"
Paul said, introducing them. "He has told me a lot about you," said Mrs. Morel. "I hope you don't mind me coming," Clara said. Paul felt his heart fill with pain. This was too much happiness for him to bear. His mother looked at him and saw how much of a man he had become. He was tall and good-looking and looked very serious in his Sunday clothes. It would be hard for any woman to keep him for long, she thought. She started to feel a little sorry for Clara. It made Paul very happy that Clara and his mother spent the afternoon talking like old friends. Clara relaxed more and more as the day went on. She became her natural self and seemed to be enjoying herself. But still, Paul worried about what his mother really thought. He knew that she could be friendly with someone that she did not like, but he thought that their first meeting had been a success. A week later they went to see a show in Nottingham. Paul thought himself the luckiest man alive to be sitting next to such a beautiful woman. He did not pay much attention to the show. It was much more enjoyable watching Clara. The show finished late. Paul missed the last train home, so he had to either stay at Clara's house or walk the long way home. Clara told him he must stay, the only problem being that Clara lived with her mother. When they got to her house, Clara told her mother that Paul was a friend from work who had missed the train. Her mother was not happy, but there was little she could do at such a late hour. Their bedrooms faced each other. Paul waited for her mother to go to bed, and as quietly as he could, he went to Clara's room. He opened the door. She was sitting on the bed, facing the other direction. He was amazed at her beauty. Her back was long, and her skin glowed like the sun. He walked to her, and she did not turn around. He put one hand on her shoulder, and with the other turned her face. She put her arms over his legs. His blood moved hot through him. He picked her up, and she put her face against his chest. His hands moved all over her body. They kissed deep and long.
"Come to my room,"
he said. She looked at him and shook her head. Her eyes were full of desire.
"Come,"
he said. Again she shook her head.
"Why not?"
he asked. She looked at him sorrowfully and shook her head again. He gave up and went back to his room. Later he wondered why she had not said yes. Her mother would have known, but that would have to happen sooner or later. She could have stayed with him all night, and then forever in his heart. The next morning, Clara acted like nothing had happened the night before. She was happy in front of her mother, and when she was out of the room she asked Paul if he wanted to take a holiday together. He did not know what to think. He told her he would think about it. Chapter 13. Mr. Dawes. Soon after that day, Paul was having a drink with some friends when Baxter Dawes, Clara's husband, walked in. He was known all over town as a wild man. He drank a lot and was often in fights. When he walked in, he had already been drinking for many hours. Everyone could see that he was drunk. Paul hated him. When Paul went to order some drinks for his friends, Baxter Dawes looked at him and said,
"You are Morel's boy, aren't you?" "Yes, I am,"
Paul said.
"Tell your father that I said he is the stupidest man I have ever met,"
Dawes said. Paul was very angry. He did not know how his father and Dawes knew each other, but he did not care. He would defend his family.
"Well, you are the stupidest man I have ever met, you ugly pig, and I should know,"
Paul said angrily. Dawes suddenly ran at Paul. He took hold of his shirt and pushed him against the wall.
"What did you say?"
Dawes said, pressing his face against Paul's. Paul said nothing. He had never been in a fight before, and he was now very afraid.
"Come outside with me, and I'll teach you a lesson, boy,"
Dawes said. Two men took Dawes by the arms and pulled him towards the door.
"I'll see you again, boy,"
Dawes said, as they threw him out onto the street. Paul stood, not moving. He was white with fear. He would have died rather than have his mother hear of the fight. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that there were now a lot of things he did not want his mother to know. He had a separate life now, his sexual life. The rest was hers, though. He told Clara about what had happened. She was very angry. "What are you going to do?" she asked.
"There is nothing I can do, really,"
he said. "You can fight him if you have to," she said.
"No, I'm no good at fighting. Most men have a natural feeling for it, but I don't,"
he said. Clara worried about her lover. She knew the type of man her husband was, and she knew that there would be more trouble. Clara was very much in love with him, and he with her. When he was painting, he forgot about her. That was his world. But for Clara, it was different. She thought about him every minute of every day. She had no world of her own now. He knew that every night that he did not see her, she was very sad, so he tried to spend as much time as possible with her. Their time spent together was pure happiness. They could sit for hours, not saying a word, happy just to be together. One night they were out walking. Something was troubling him. She could feel it in her bones. When they came to a bridge, he stopped. He stood looking down at the water. He seemed a long way away. "Will you always stay here?" she asked him.
No, I'll leave soon to travel the world,
he answered. "Travel the world? Why?" she said in surprise.
I don't know. I feel that I have to leave,
he said. There was a silence. The wind made the water break and move. He put his hand on her shoulder.
Don't ask me anything about the future. I don't know what I'm going to do, but now I'm with you. That is all that is important to me,
he said. She took him in her arms. After all, she was a married woman, and she had no right even to what he gave her now. He needed her badly. She had him in her arms, and he was sad, sad for the life he must live. With her warmth, she tried to make him feel better. She loved him. She would be happy with every moment he could give her. After a moment, he lifted his head.
Clara,
he said. She held him passionately. She pressed his head down onto her chest. She would do anything to take away the pain that showed in his voice. He could have anything he wanted from her, anything. All she wanted at that moment was his happiness. Soon the sorrow in his mind died down, but Clara was gone. All that was left was a woman, warm and loving and something to love. His love became that of an animal. He was alone. Alone forever now. He knew now that love would never be anything more than the passion of two separate people. It would end or die, and he would always be left alone. The closest you could ever get to another person was never going to be close enough to take away the loneliness of being alive. Clara was unhappy. She could feel the love between them, but she could not keep hold of him. His being was too big and wild. She worried that she would never be able to call him her own. He seemed to be too big for one woman. There would always be a part of him that she could never know. So the battle began between them. She knew that he would never fully be hers, and he knew that in some way she still thought of herself as a married woman. Her passion for the young man had filled her life. She felt more alive now than she ever had. But in the back of her mind, she knew that they would go their own ways in the end, and that the rest of her life would be sad because he was gone. One night after he had left Clara and was walking to the train station, he saw a man approaching through the snow.
Good evening,
the man said.
Good evening,
Paul said, not taking any notice of the stranger.
Paul Morel,
said the man. Then he knew it was Dawes. He stopped.
I have got you now,
said Dawes.
Excuse me, I will miss my train,
said Paul.
You're going to get it now, boy,
Dawes told him. Paul started to walk away, but Dawes stepped in front of him. Before he knew what had happened, he was falling backwards, having been hit. Everything went black. He came to his senses with a feeling of great anger. He began to fight. Dawes was a much bigger man and had been in many fights before, but at first Paul was winning. He hit Dawes as hard as he could, and in the middle of his anger, he did not care if he killed him. But Dawes soon started to fight back. He beat Paul about the head. He was a grown man, and his strength tired the younger man. Paul fell to the ground. Dawes kicked him in the stomach to make sure he would not get up again. Then he ran off down a dark street. Paul woke up a few minutes later. He knew where he was and what had happened. He picked himself up and headed for home. When he got home, he was happy that everyone had gone to bed. His body was hurting very much now. He looked at himself in the mirror. His face was covered in blood. He looked like a dead man. In the morning he woke up to see his mother looking down at him.
"It is nothing, Mother. Don't worry,"
he told her.
"It was Baxter Dawes."
Mrs. Morel said nothing. She quietly did all she could do to make her son feel better. She never asked about what had happened. All she cared about was that her son was now at home and safe. Clara came to visit him, but she made him feel tired and hopeless. He told her that he would come to see her when he was better. Miriam also came, but she was like a stranger to him now. The only person he wanted to see was his mother. Some weeks after Paul had recovered, he noticed that his mother was looking very tired. He told her that he would pay for her to see a doctor. At first she said that she did not need to, but after a few more days it was clear to everyone, including herself, that she must. It was a great shock to all of the family when she returned home from the doctor and told them that she needed to go to the hospital. She needed an operation. It seemed impossible that this little woman, who had held the family together for so many years, was now in danger. It had always been her that everyone turned to in times of trouble. What would they do now? Chapter 14. The Release. Mrs. Morel was getting worse. They now had to carry her around the house. She spent all day sitting in her chair looking hopeless. Paul and she were afraid of each other. He knew and she knew that she was dying, but they kept up the act of being happy. Every morning when he woke up, he went into her room to see if she was well.
"Has it been bad?"
he asked. "Fine," she said. He knew that she was not telling him the truth. Even to the end, she would do all she could to protect her children. Then he would go to get her breakfast. All day he thought only of her. After he got home from work, he went straight up to her room.
"Did you have a good day?"
he asked her. "A little tired," she answered. He sat on her bed and tried not to look unhappy. At night he would paint in her room so they could talk. They talked like they did years ago. They were the best of friends again. When their eyes met, she smiled. Paul was filled by sadness. He could not even think about what life would be like without her. He felt as if his life was being destroyed piece by piece. Often tears came to his eyes. At work, he could not concentrate on what he was doing. He would sit and think about his mother. Mrs. Morel tried not to think about death. She thought of the pain she was feeling the next day, her husband or her children, but never about death. That would come soon enough. Sometimes when they sat together at night, they could think of nothing to say, but they were together. That was enough. At last he would stand up to go to bed. He leaned against the door, not able to go any further. The thought of her leaving was too much. He did not see Clara very often. When he did, he would knock on her door, and when she opened it, he simply said,
"Take me."
She did, but she was afraid. He had her body, but she never had his mind. It was as if he were using her to forget. He wanted her, he had her, and it made her feel as if death itself was coming inside her. There was no man loving her. She almost hated him. The days and weeks went by. He went from person to person for help, but no one had any to offer. No one could take away the pain. Miriam had written to him, and he went to see her. "How is she?" she asked.
"The same, but the doctor says the time is coming,"
he answered. Paul knew that Miriam could not help him now. He had to face the fact that there was no escape from the pain. Life was kicking him far harder than Baxter Dawes had. This was what it was to be truly alive. Suffering was life. Paul stayed at home all the time now. They did not have enough money to pay a nurse. But that did not matter. He would have stayed at home even if they had. He was going to be there when she needed him, like she had always been there for him. Mrs. Morel kept holding on to life. Sometimes she and Paul could laugh together like there was nothing to worry about, but the knowledge that death was near would return quickly. One day they called for the nurse.
"She can go on for days, can't she?"
Paul asked her. "No, Mr. Morel, she can't," the nurse said. There was silence. "You should go downstairs now. I'll call you if anything happens," said the nurse. He went and sat with his brother and sister. He could not stand being still, so he walked out into the garden. He felt something inside him break. Annie came running out of the house. He knew already what she would say. "Paul, she's gone," she screamed. He ran back into the house and upstairs. She lay on her bed, not looking any different. He sat on the bed and held her hand.
"My love, my love, my love,"
he cried over and over again. Walter Morel came home from work at 4 o'clock. He walked silently into the house and sat down. Tired, he closed his eyes and sat without moving. Paul wondered if he knew. It was some time and no one had spoken. At last the son said,
"She's gone." "What time?"
was all he asked. After he had finished eating his dinner, he went out. Annie and Arthur were shocked by the fact that he did not seem to care, but Paul guessed differently. When a man has been married to a woman for over 30 years, she is no longer a woman or a wife. She is half of her husband's soul. It was not that Morel did not care. It was the fact that half of him had just died, and he knew that the other half would soon follow. In life he was hers, and in death he would be hers as well. Theirs was a bond that death could not break. Later that night, when the children had gone to bed, he went into her room. He did not kiss her for fear that she would be cold and different from the woman he had loved. He saw her as the girl he had first fallen in love with.
My dear,"
he whispered, and left. Paul kept busy doing all that had to be done. On the day of the funeral, it rained heavily. Afterwards, with all the family and friends in the house, Paul walked into the garden to be alone. She was gone, and life would never be the same. He cried bitter tears. In the weeks that followed, he saw Clara often, but it was different between them now. He saw things more clearly. She knew that he had changed and that she had lost him. As soon as she thought that, without wanting to, she thought again of her husband. Chapter 15. Destroyed. Paul knew what would happen. And he was right. Clara went back to her husband, and they moved to the city of Sheffield. He never saw her again. Walter Morel was slowly falling apart. He tried to carry on with life as if nothing had happened, but all the light in his eyes had gone. Neither the father nor the son could stand living in the house now that she was gone. So Paul moved to Nottingham, and Morel moved in with a friendly family in town. Nothing seemed to have any meaning for Paul. Life was empty. He started drinking heavily. After work, he would go to a bar and drink until he could drink no more. He got into fights and would often arrive at work with black eyes. He stopped painting and could not imagine a time when he would start again. The weeks passed, and he was becoming more and more hopeless. He was always alone. One night he came home to his dirty little apartment and thought of killing himself. He sat on the bed thinking of the reasons why he shouldn't, and then a voice in his head told him,
"Because of her."
He sat up and realized that he was doing the exact opposite of what his mother would want him to do. He told himself,
"She's dead. But what did her life mean? I'm alive. She's not. But she is still inside me. I have to stay alive for her."
More time passed. He sometimes thought that he should go to Miriam and ask her to marry him. Then his mother would live on through their children. But he knew that was the wrong thing to do. If he married her, he would be killing that part of himself that was different and special. He realized that it was not for him, the life of ordinary men. His happiness was not to be found in a wife, a home, and children. If he was to ever be happy, it was to be through his art. He felt sad that he was to be forever separate from other people. But it was that separateness that would give him the chance to see life. An artist needed to step away from life so he could see it clearly. He decided to leave Nottingham and the county. He would travel the world to experience how all the people of the world lived. His life would take him to strange places, but he felt strong because now he knew what he had to do. On the day he was to leave, he returned to the old house. He stood in the garden and remembered all the years of his youth. He cried, but these were not sad tears. They were tears of thanks. They were tears for all the happiness, sorrow, fear, joy, and magic of life. He would spend the rest of his life trying to capture those feelings in his art. The last thing he did before he left was to visit his mother's grave. He placed a bunch of flowers on the ground and said quietly,
"Thank you."